They said the silence out here would heal a man's soul. They never mentioned the sounds it makes right before it breaks. My name is Elias, and I was told this tower would be a sanctuary, a place to forget. But it's not a sanctuary. It's a machine, meticulously designed for a purpose I'm only now beginning to understand. And these old, weary walls, they are screaming. This isn't a story about finding peace. It's a record of how I became a part of the architecture of fear. The final 10 miles of the drive were a kind of decompression. The asphalt had given way to gravel, the gravel to a rutted dirt track that coiled around the mountain like a serpent. With every turn, the world I was escaping, a world of sirens, angry phone calls, and the ghost of twisting metal against a concrete sky, fell away below, shrouded in a blanket of smog. I was grateful to be rising above. My truck's engine whined in second gear, the only sound for miles besides the crunch of tires and the occasional caw of a raven. When I finally broke through the tree line, the view was so vast, so staggeringly beautiful, it felt like a physical blow. A sea of green and gold treetops stretched to a horizon that was impossibly distant, all under a sapphire blue sky. And there it was, the Arapahoe Peak Lookout. It wasn't just a structure, it was a statement. As an architect, or rather, a former architect, I could see the history in its bones. It stood on 4 thick, cross-braced timber legs, sunk into a formidable concrete base that looked more like a military bunker's foundation. The cabin itself, a single square room walled in by windows, sat 100 feet in the air, a glass eye staring out at the world. It was a monument to practicality and endurance, built in an era when things were made to last. A deep, instinctual part of me, the part that had once found solace in blueprints and stress calculations, felt a sense of profound calm. This place had rules. It had structure. It was solid. After hauling my gear up the seemingly endless flights of wooden stairs, the exertion leaving my lungs burning in the thin air, I stepped into my new home. The inside smelled of old wood, kerosene, and the clean metallic scent of ozone from the recent passage of a storm. It was Spartan, but perfect. A cot, a small kitchenette, a desk with a radio and the centerpiece, the Osborne Firefinder, a beautiful brass instrument sitting in the middle of the room. For the first time in a year, the constant, grinding anxiety in my chest eased its grip. Here, my only job was to watch, to be vigilant. A simple, noble purpose. I spent the first day falling into a routine, a ritual of order that my soul desperately craved. I unpacked my clothes with military precision, arranged my books alphabetically on the single shelf, and cleaned every surface until the old wood gleamed. It was during this purge, this imposition of my own order onto the space, that I found the journal. It was tucked away in the back of a drawer beneath the cot, a drawer whose runners were so warped it took a considerable effort to open. It was a thick, leather-bound ledger, its cover worn smooth with time and handling. There was no title. I opened it, and the first page was written in a precise, almost engraved cursive. Property of Silas Crane. Arapahoe Peak Lookout. Last entry, August 14th. That was just a few weeks ago. I felt a small connection to this stranger, this man whose life I was now inhabiting. The first 20 or so pages were exactly what I expected. Weather observations, notes on wildlife sightings, a black bear with 2 cubs, a herd of elk, the migratory patterns of hawks. His prose was dry, factual. The man was clearly methodical. I found myself nodding in approval. Then the tone changed. It was abrupt. One page ended with a note about cirrus cloud formations, and the next began with a new stark heading, underlined twice. Structural integrity protocols and essential maintenance. Beneath it was a numbered list. My architect's curiosity was piqued. I expected notes on checking for wood rot or clearing the gutters. I was wrong. Rule number 1, the kerosene lamp located on the western windowsill must remain lit at all times between sunset and sunrise. No exceptions. Its specific wavelength of light and thermal output serve to stabilize the molecular integrity of the primary foundation block. I read it twice. Stabilize the foundation? With a kerosene lamp, it was absurd. The thermal output would be negligible, and the idea of light affecting concrete was the stuff of fantasy. I scoffed, but a part of my brain, the part that had seen the impossible happen, when a single miscalculation brought a 40-story building down, filed it away. Perhaps it was a quirky metaphor for keeping the damp out of the old concrete, a folksy bit of wisdom passed down through generations of watchmen. I read the next rule. Rule number 4. The cellar hatch in the center of the floor must never be locked or obstructed. The structure requires a constant, unimpeded airflow from the subterranean cavity to equalize esoteric pressure differentials. Locking the hatch can lead to catastrophic vibrational resonance. Esoteric pressure differentials. The language was a strange mix of the technical and the arcane. Again, I tried to rationalize it. Old buildings need to breathe, certainly. Maybe Silas was just a self-taught engineer with a flair for the dramatic. I knelt and examined the hatch. It was a thick wooden trapdoor flush with the floor, with a simple iron ring for a handle. It was unlocked. I continued reading, an uneasy feeling starting to curdle in my stomach. Rule number 6. Should the primary radio unit emit a 3-tone ascending chime, the external antenna must be immediately rotated 15 degrees to the geographic north. The chime is an indicator of harmonic misalignment with the local geomagnetic field. Failure to correct will result in signal corruption and potential damage to sensitive equipment. Rule number 9. Any scratching, tapping, or scraping sounds heard from within the walls or floorboards should be disregarded. They are a normal acoustic byproduct of the tower's structural materials, settling under advanced atmospheric and gravitational stress. Do not investigate. Rule number 11. Do not leave ferrous metal objects, iron, steel, directly on the concrete floor of the cellar for more than a 12-hour period. A low-level anomalous magnetic field resides within the foundation and will permanently magnetize them. The list went on, each rule more bizarre and specific than the last. My initial amusement had soured into a quiet dread. This wasn't the journal of a methodical man, it was the meticulous, detailed manifesto of a madman. A man who had spent far too long up here alone, inventing a complex fantasy to give meaning to the creaks and groans of an old building. The man, my supervisor, a gruff fellow named Harris, had simply said, "Took an early retirement." A part of me wanted to toss the journal back in the drawer and forget it, to rely on my own knowledge of physics and architecture, but I couldn't. The trauma of my failure, the ghost of that collapsed building, had shattered my professional arrogance. It had taught me that there are always forces and factors you don't account for. What if I was wrong? What if this lonely, eccentric man had discovered some strange, localized phenomena that defied conventional science? My need for order, for a system to follow, won out. I would follow his rules, not because I believed them, but because it was the most orderly, cautious path forward. I would treat it as an experiment. I would inhabit the role of Silas Crane and follow his bizarre maintenance schedule to the letter. As dusk began to bleed across the horizon, painting the sky in violent shades of orange and purple, I retrieved the kerosene lamp. It was an old, heavy brass model, its glass chimney spotless. I filled it, trimmed the wick, and as the last sliver of the sun vanished, I lit it. A warm, golden glow pushed back against the encroaching darkness. I placed it on the western windowsill, exactly as rule number 1 dictated. It felt foolish, like a superstitious ritual, but it also felt right. The simple act of following an instruction was comforting. Night fell completely. The world beyond the windows dissolved into an absolute featureless black. The wind picked up, a low, mournful howl that seemed to be searching for a way into the cabin. The tower swayed, just slightly, a gentle, rhythmic motion it was designed for. I made a simple dinner, the silence in the cabin so profound I could hear my own heartbeat. Later, as I lay on my cot reading, I heard it, a faint scratching sound. It seemed to come from directly beneath my feet, from within the thick wooden floorboards. Rule number 9, I thought immediately, normal acoustic byproduct. I tried to dismiss it, to focus on my book, but it was persistent. It wasn't the random creaking of old wood, it was rhythmic. Scrape, pause, scrape, pause, like a nail being dragged slowly across the grain. I closed my eyes and forced myself to breathe evenly, my rational mind battling a primal urge to rip the floorboards up. It's the wind, I told myself. It's a branch brushing against one of the support legs. It's anything but what it sounds like. The wind grew stronger, shrieking around the corners of the cabin. I was just starting to drift into an uneasy sleep when a particularly violent gust slammed against the western face of the tower. It wasn't just a push. It was a physical blow that made the entire structure shudder. And through a tiny, unnoticed crack in the window frame, a jet of air shot into the room. It hit the kerosene lamp. The flame danced wildly for a second, a frantic, desperate thing. Then it sputtered, shrank, and died. The cabin was plunged into an inky blackness, the only light coming from the distant, indifferent stars. For a long, breathless moment, there was only the sound of the wind and my own frantic pulse. I almost laughed, a hysterical sound bubbling in my throat. I was terrified of the dark because of a dead man's insane scribblings. I swung my legs off the cot, fumbling on the small table for my lighter. And then it started. It wasn't a sound, it was a feeling, a low-frequency hum that vibrated up from the soles of my feet, through my bones, and into my teeth. It emanated from the concrete foundation, a deep, resonant thrumming like a colossal generator coming to life far below me. The tower, which had gracefully swayed with the wind before, was now trembling with a tight, dangerous vibration. The hum grew louder, escalating into a deep, guttural groan. It was the sound of 1,000 tons of material being pushed past its breaking point. It was the sound I had nightmares about, the scream of a structure in its death throes. Dust and tiny splinters of wood rained down from the ceiling. A hairline crack spiderwebbed across one of the thick window panes. The entire world was shaking. This wasn't the wind. This wasn't my imagination. The tower was tearing itself apart. Panic, cold and absolute, seized me. The lamp. Rule number 1. My hands, clumsy with terror, found the lighter. I flicked it once, twice, a spark. Nothing. My thumb was slick with sweat. On the third try, a tiny flame appeared. Shielding it with my hand, I leaned towards the lamp, my heart hammering against my ribs. I found the wick. The flame caught, wavered for a terrifying second, and then blossomed into a steady golden glow. The very instant the light returned, the groaning stopped. The vibration ceased. The terrible grinding tension in the structure vanished as if it had never been. Silence. A silence so complete, so absolute, it was more terrifying than the noise it had replaced. I was frozen, kneeling on the floor, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I stared at the small, innocuous flame of the kerosene lamp. It wasn't a light source. It was a leash. It was a key in a lock. It was the only thing holding this place together. Silas wasn't mad, he was a keeper. I don't know what kind of entity or forces coiled in the foundation of this mountain, but I now know that this tower isn't here to watch for fires. It's a cage. And I, the new janitor, just learned what happens when you forget to feed the beast. If you want to understand the true nature of the architecture I'm trapped in, and what other horrors are buried in the pages of this journal, make sure you subscribe to this channel and turn on notifications. The foundation is stable for now, but the sun is going to rise soon, and I have no idea what new rules the daytime brings. Sleep did not come. How could it? Every time I closed my eyes, I felt that bone-jarring vibration, heard that grinding structural scream. I spent the night sitting on the cot, my back pressed against the wall, watching the kerosene lamp burn with the intensity of a castaway, watching a rescue ship's searchlight. It was no longer a piece of antique equipment. It was a totem, a ward against a physics I didn't comprehend. The darkness outside the windows was no longer empty. It was a presence, held at bay by a single fragile flame. When dawn finally arrived, it brought no relief. The rising sun didn't banish the shadows, it merely gave them definition. The vast, beautiful wilderness I had admired just yesterday now seemed like the skin of an ocean, hiding unfathomable depths. The tower no longer felt like a sanctuary. It felt like a cage suspended over an abyss. My previous life, the life of blueprints and building codes, felt like a distant, naive dream. That world operated on principles of tensile strength and load distribution. This place operated on the terrifying logic of Silas Crane's journal. My first task was not to make coffee or report the morning's visibility. It was to reread the journal. This time, it was not with the skeptical curiosity of a man humoring a madman's legacy. It was with the desperate focus of a bomb disposal technician reading a disarming manual. I sat at the desk, the leather-bound book open before me, the kerosene lamp still burning beside me, even as sunlight streamed into the cabin. I would not be blowing it out. Ever. I pored over every entry, every rule, searching for a pattern, a key, anything that could give me a strategic advantage. The language that had once seemed eccentric now felt chillingly precise. Rule number 2. The rainwater collection barrel on the eastern side of the catwalk must be kept at a minimum of half full. The water's specific mineral composition, acquired from atmospheric contact at this altitude, is essential for dampening certain high-frequency telluric emissions from the foundation. Rule number 7. Do not operate any music-playing device that produces complex harmonic frequencies, e.g., classical orchestras, choral arrangements. Stick to simple melodies or monotonic recordings. Complex waveforms create sympathetic resonance within the timber supports, weakening them at a microscopic level. Rule Hausger 14. When using the binoculars for observation, do not focus on the shadowed basin to the northwest, designated Whispering Gulch on the maps. Optical magnification of this specific area appears to amplify a localized distortion field. Documented side effects include acute vertigo, auditory hallucinations, and temporary retinal bleeding. My blood ran cold. I was the steward of an impossibly complex and fragile system. This tower wasn't a passive structure. It was an active piece of machinery, and I was its operator, its maintenance man. The rules were not suggestions. They were the operating parameters. I spent the next few hours in a frantic state of compliance. I checked the rainwater barrel. It was thankfully near full. I made a mental note to never use my small handheld radio for anything but the simplest of folk music. And I threw a heavy canvas tarp over the case containing my high-powered binoculars. My architect's mind, now fully engaged in this new, terrifying reality, demanded a physical inspection. I needed to understand the machine. I started inside the cabin. I ran my hands along the thick wooden beams overhead. They were covered in carved markings, which I had initially dismissed as decorative. Now I saw they weren't random. They were continuous, intricate lines that flowed from the walls to the central support column, branching and converging like the traces on a circuit board. They were everywhere, a web of silent, geometric purpose etched into the very bones of my prison. Where the lines met at key structural joints, small dark discs of an unknown, non-metallic material had been inlaid into the wood. They were cool to the touch and seemed to absorb the warmth from my fingers instantly. My attention then turned to the cellar hatch. Rule number 4 requires a constant, unimpeded airflow. Taking a deep breath, I grasped the cold iron ring and pulled. The heavy door lifted with a groan of old hinges. A wave of cool, damp air washed over me. It carried a strange scent, a mixture of ozone, whetstone, and something else. A faint, sharp, metallic odor, like antique brass or freshly struck flint. I peered into the darkness below. My flashlight beam cut through the gloom, revealing not a cellar but the top of the concrete foundation itself. It was a massive, solid block that filled the entirety of the space beneath the cabin. The surface wasn't the rough, grey concrete I expected. It was unnaturally smooth, almost polished, and seemed to be shot through with faint dark blue veins of a substance that reflected the light with a subtle, oily sheen. The constant low-level hum I now felt in my bones was palpably stronger here, emanating directly from the block. The foundation was the source. It was the engine. As I stared, my light caught something on the far side. A small metal plate was bolted to the concrete. I leaned further, my heart pounding, and managed to read the stamped text. It wasn't from the Forest Service. It was from a defunct mining corporation, one I vaguely remembered from my studies, as having been involved in experimental geological surveys in the 1950s, before abruptly going bankrupt. The plate read, Project Chimera, Primary Containment and Geoharmonic Dampener, Unit 01. Warning, adhere to established maintenance protocols. Esoteric resonance must remain within designated parameters at all times. I slammed the hatch shut, my hands trembling. The journal wasn't Silas's madness. It was an official, if bizarre, operating manual. This entire tower, this entire project, was built to contain... what? The name itself, Chimera, suggested a hybrid, an unnatural fusion of things. Was there something alive down there? Or was it some kind of geological anomaly, a pocket of alien physics that the tower was built to pacify? The answer came sooner than I expected. Around midday, as I was nervously making a log entry, it happened. The sharp, three-toned ascending chime from rule number 6. It didn't come from the radio speaker. It chimed through the very air of the cabin, a clean digital sound that was utterly alien to this rustic environment. Beep, beep, beep. My blood turned to ice. Antenna must be immediately rotated 15 degrees to the geographic north. I scrambled from my chair, my feet tangling in the legs. The antenna control was a rusty hand crank on the wall, connected by a series of gears to the mast on the roof. I grabbed the crank and began to turn, my eyes darting to the old compass mounted beside it. The gears groaned in protest. 15 degrees. It felt like a mile. As I cranked, the radio crackled to life. It wasn't a voice. It was a sound like 1,000 sheets of paper being ripped at once. A high-frequency shriek that vibrated behind my eyeballs. It was the sound of raw information, of signal corruption. It felt like the machine was having a seizure. Come on, I muttered, heaving on the crank. The needle on the compass crept past 10 degrees, then 12. The shrieking from the radio intensified, and now it was accompanied by a chorus of distorted, overlapping voices. Fragments of old broadcasts, whispers, anguished cries, all tangled together into a meaningless, terrifying babble. The needle touched 15. I locked the crank in place. Instantly the shrieking stopped. The voices vanished. The radio returned to a gentle background hiss. I stood there panting, sweat beading on my forehead. I had done it. I had followed the protocol. I had averted whatever that was. A test. The system had tested me, and I had passed. The rest of the day was quiet, but the silence was now heavy with threat. I realized I was living on a razor's edge. My life depended on my absolute, unquestioning obedience to a set of impossible rules. My meticulous nature, once a source of professional pride, was now the only thing keeping me alive. The real challenge came late in the afternoon. I was cleaning the kitchenette, my movements jerky and paranoid, when a flash of movement outside the eastern window caught my eye. A large goshawk, its wings tucked, was diving out of the sky at an incredible speed. I watched, mesmerized for a second, before I realized its trajectory. It wasn't hunting. It was aimed directly at the tower. It struck the window with a sickening, wet thud. The glass, thick and reinforced, held, but the impact sent a tremor through the cabin. The bird, its neck broken, fell away. But the damage was done. The force of the collision had caused a stack of tin plates I had foolishly left near the cellar hatch to topple over. One of them slid across the floor and landed perfectly over the iron ring of the hatch, covering it and obstructing it. Rule number 4, the cellar hatch, must never be obstructed. Before I could even move to correct it, the tower reacted. There was no groan this time, no violent shaking. There was only a subtle change in the air pressure that made my ears pop. And then a fine, black dust began to rise from between the floorboards. It didn't puff up, it seeped, rising in thin, curling tendrils like smoke. It had no smell, but it carried a palpable static charge. I could feel the hairs on my arms stand up. The dust coalesced in the air, drifting slowly, not settling. It was drawn towards the single tin plate. I watched, frozen in horror, as the black particles gathered around the plate. They clung to its surface, coating it in a layer of velvety black. Then the plate began to tremble. It lifted a fraction of an inch off the floor, hovering, held aloft by the strange magnetic dust. It turned slowly in the air, as if being examined. This was not a structural failure. This was a response, an intelligent, deliberate response. The machine was investigating the blockage. With a surge of adrenaline, I lunged forward and snatched the plate out of the air. The black dust instantly lost its cohesion and dissipated, falling to the floor and vanishing back into the cracks from which it came. I was left holding the tin plate, my heart trying to beat its way out of my chest. I had survived another test, but this was different. The first incident had been raw, uncontrolled power. This had been precise, calculated. It was learning. It was adapting. That night I couldn't bring myself to even look at the journal. I felt like a rat in a maze, learning the pathways to avoid the electric shock. My freedom was an illusion, my every action dictated by the whims of the ancient, unknowable machine I was trapped inside. My sanity was a currency I was spending with every passing hour. It was in a fit of desperate, paranoid energy, around 3 a.m., that I went back to the journal. I had to know more. I had to find a flaw, an escape clause. I thumbed through the pages again and again. It was then that I noticed it. Page 47, the page detailing the protocol for replacing the lightning rod cables, felt thicker than the others. Subtly, but noticeably so. My fingers, trembling, went to the edge of the page. I picked at the corner. It wasn't one page, it was two, glued together with meticulous care around the edges. A tiny pocket of air was trapped between them. My breath hitched. Using the small blade of my pocket knife, I carefully slit the edge of the page. It opened like an envelope. Tucked inside was a small, folded piece of paper, brittle with age. The handwriting on it was not the neat, precise cursive of the journal. It was a frantic, terrified scrawl, the letters dug into the paper with immense pressure. It was the real Silas. The note was short, a final, desperate testament. He made me write the rest. The rules aren't to protect the tower. The tower is to contain what is below. All this time I thought I was its warden. But the protocols, the light, the water, it's not maintenance, it's sustenance. Every rule you follow, you're not calming it, you're feeding it. The world had inverted. Silas's frantic, desperate words scrawled on that brittle piece of paper had not provided a key. They had transformed the prison. I was no longer a warden nervously guarding a dangerous inmate. I was a trust-funded fool, an unwitting accomplice, dutifully sliding a feast through the bars to a monster I was supposed to be containing. Every rule you follow, you're not calming it, you're feeding it. The phrase echoed in the cavern of my skull, a new and more terrible mantra. I stared at the kerosene lamp, its golden light no longer a comforting ward, but a sickening, syrupy glow. I had believed its flame was keeping the foundation from shaking apart. The truth was infinitely more grotesque. The lamp was a heat source, a specific frequency of energy, a meal. I was warming the beast's dinner. The rainwater in the barrel wasn't dampening telluric emissions. It was providing a necessary mineral, a vital nutrient. The antenna adjustments weren't preventing signal corruption. They were fine-tuning the receiver, allowing the entity to better absorb the ambient energies of the world outside. This tower wasn't a cage. It was a complex, self-sustaining feeding apparatus, and I was the fool who kept it running. A wave of nausea washed over me. I thought back to the previous night, to the violent, groaning tremor that had nearly shaken the cabin from its legs. That wasn't a tantrum, it wasn't a threat. It was the physical reaction of a complex system being momentarily deprived of a key energy source. It was a hunger pang. The black dust that had risen from the floorboards wasn't an attack. It was a sensory organ, a pseudopod extending from the main body to investigate the interruption of its food supply. My mind, the architect's mind that craves order and understands systems, began to race processing this new, horrifying data. The entire structure was a life support machine. The carved sigils in the wooden beams were the circuitry. The foundation, the primary containment and geoharmonic dampener, was the stomach. And the entity, Project Chimera, was the patient, the parasite, the god in the machine. What did that make me? A slave. A zookeeper for a thing that should not exist. But knowledge, even terrifying knowledge, is a form of power. For the first time since my arrival, I felt a flicker of something other than fear. Rage. A cold, hard, architectural rage. I had been deceived. The system had a hidden purpose, and my role was not one of vigilance but of complicity. I would not be a party to it. But what could I do? The dilemma was perfect. a philosophical death trap. If I continued to follow the rules, I would strengthen the entity, feeding it until... What? Until it was strong enough to break free? But if I stopped, if I let the lamp go out or the rainwater barrel run dry, the tower itself would react violently. I would be killed in the catastrophic failure of the containment system long before the entity starved. I was trapped in a feedback loop from hell. I had to find a third option. I had to disrupt the system in a way it couldn't anticipate. I needed to stop feeding the beast without triggering the self-destruct sequence. My eyes were drawn again to the cellar hatch in the center of the floor. Rule before. Unimpeded airflow from the subterranean cavity to equalize esoteric pressure differentials. It was the most direct interface with the foundation, with the entity itself. The air rising from it carried that distinct metallic tang, the breath of the thing below. What if I cut off its air? It was a terrifying prospect. The rule was explicit. Obstructing it had already caused the phenomenon of the black dust. Locking it. The journal warned of catastrophic vibrational resonance. But the journal was a lie, a manual written by the enemy. Its warnings were designed to ensure my compliance. Perhaps the most dire warnings guarded the creature's greatest vulnerabilities. I had to test it. I had to break a rule not by accident, but with intent. I would declare my defiance. My plan was simple, and its simplicity terrified me. The hatch had an iron ring but no lock. I would need to improvise one. I remembered seeing a box of old maintenance supplies on a shelf, rusted tools, coils of wire, and heavy iron spikes for securing guy wires. Amongst them, I found a thick, heavy-duty hasp and a solid-looking padlock, both coated in a layer of rust. They would do. The next few hours were spent in a state of hyper-focused dread. Every action was deliberate. I screwed the hasp into the thick wood of the trapdoor and the surrounding floorboards, the rasp of the screwdriver deafening in the silence. My hands were slick with sweat. I felt like I was fortifying a tomb from the inside. With every turn of the screw, I expected the tower to groan in protest, for the black dust to seep from the cracks. But there was nothing, only the patient, ever-present hum from below. It was waiting, watching. When the hasp was secure, I stood over the open hatch for a long moment, the padlock heavy in my hand. I stared down at the smooth, dark, veined surface of the foundation block. I was staring at the skin of a leviathan. "No more," I whispered, the words feeling thin and foolish in the charged air. "The kitchen is closed." I slammed the heavy wooden door shut. The sound was a definitive, echoing boom. I fitted the padlock and snapped it shut. The click of the tumblers falling into place was a sound of finality, a declaration of war. And then, silence. A profound, absolute, and utterly unnerving silence. The constant low-level hum that had been the background music to my existence here, the hum that vibrated through my bones and teeth, was gone. The tower was still. The air was dead. For an hour, I sat at the desk, every muscle tensed, waiting. Nothing happened, no vibrations, no groaning, no dust. No. A dangerous, intoxicating thought began to form in my mind. What if it was that simple? What if Silas was wrong and the entity was just a bluff, a complex system of tricks with no real power? What if the true test was simply having the courage to say no? The sense of relief was so overwhelming it was dizzying. I felt a hysterical laugh bubble up in my chest. I had done it. I had faced the beast and won. I stood up, feeling lighter than I had in days, and walked to the window, gazing out at the endless sea of trees. For the first time, it looked like a wilderness again, not a prison yard. That's when I heard it. It wasn't a creak of wood or a gust of wind. It was a sound from the other side of the cellar hatch. Tap. A single, soft, deliberate tap, like a person rapping a knuckle against a wooden door. I froze, my blood turning to ice water in my veins. Tap, tap. It was a pattern. A signal. It wasn't the random noise of a machine. It was the sound of something with patience, something with intelligence. My breath hitched in my throat. I backed away from the hatch, my eyes wide with a new, more profound level of terror than I had ever known. The silence had been a trick. It hadn't been powered down, it had been listening. Then came the voice. It didn't come from the radio. It didn't come from outside. It spoke from the wood of the trapdoor itself, a low, resonant whisper that vibrated through the floor and up my legs. It was ancient, calm, and filled with a terrible, patient intelligence. "I know what you are doing, architect." The word struck me like a physical blow. Architect. It knew me. It wasn't just some blind, hungry force of nature. It had access to my thoughts, my identity. The pride I had once felt in my profession was now being used as a weapon against me. A name to pin me down like an insect in a display case. I couldn't speak. I couldn't move. I could only stare at the locked hatch, at the source of that impossible voice. The voice whispered again, its tone a horrifying mockery of gentle reason. "You have interrupted the calibration. The structural harmony is delicate. That lock is an unnecessary complication, a miscalculation. You of all people should understand the consequences of a single miscalculation." It was twisting the knife. It knew about the building collapse. It knew the guilt that haunted my every waking moment. It was inside my head, rummaging through my darkest secrets with cold, curious fingers. This wasn't a monster of flesh and blood. It was a monster of consciousness. Before I could process this ultimate violation, the radio on the desk crackled to life, startling a strangled cry from my throat. It was the voice of Harris, my supervisor from the Forest Service. His voice was a beacon of normalcy in a world that had gone insane. "Elias, you read me, Arapaho Peak? Just doing a systems check." I scrambled to the desk, my hands shaking so badly I could barely grip the receiver. Harris, thank God, you have to listen to me. Something is wrong up here. Something is in the tower with me." There was a pause, a moment of static. Then Harris's voice came back, but it was different, slower. The cheerful gruffness was gone, replaced by a flat, cold cadence. "We know, Elias. The seismograph for the containment unit has registered a deviation from protocol. You have locked the primary intake valve." My heart stopped. "What? What are you talking about? Seismograph?" Another crackle of static. And then, Harris's voice seamlessly melted away, replaced by that same ancient whispering resonance that had come from the floor, now broadcast through the radio speaker, filling the small cabin. "There is nowhere to call for help, architect. There is no one listening. I am the system. I am the signal. And you have just gone offline." The voice didn't laugh. It didn't have to. The quiet, factual statement of my absolute and total isolation was the most terrifying sound I had ever heard. The radio clicked and went dead. I was alone, utterly and completely cut off from the world, locked in a room with a thing that knew my name, my profession, and my deepest, most agonizing failure. The warden had just learned that the prison walls were not for keeping the monster in. They were for keeping him locked inside with it. The severing of that final link to the outside world was not loud, but it was absolute. The dead radio was more than a silent piece of equipment. It was a tombstone marking the death of my hope. The entity wasn't just a presence trapped in the foundation. It was the master of the tower's entire nervous system. It was the signal. It was the silence. It was everything. My defiance in locking the hatch had not been an act of rebellion. It had been the clumsy move of a novice chess player, a move the master had anticipated 10 turns ago. I had not cornered it. I had only succeeded in cornering myself. The physical threats, the shaking, the black dust were gone. The entity had abandoned them. It had realized with its ancient alien intelligence that the way to break an architect was not to shatter his building, but to dismantle his mind. The siege that followed was not one of sound and fury. It was a campaign of insidious, psychological warfare, waged in the theater of my own consciousness. It began with whispers. They were not audible in the conventional sense. They didn't come from the floor or the radio. They bloomed directly inside my skull, as intimate and unwelcome as a migraine. At first, they were just fragments, echoes of my own anxieties. A single miscalculation. The stress tolerances were wrong. They trusted you. My own voice, twisted with self-loathing, playing on a loop. I tried to fight it. I paced the confines of the cabin, a caged animal, reciting multiplication tables, the names of state capitals, anything to fill the void. to drown out the intrusive thoughts. But it was like trying to shout down an echo. The entity wasn't broadcasting at me. It was resonating with the existing cracks in my sanity, making them vibrate until they threatened to splinter. With my physical defiance rendered meaningless, I turned my energy to defense. I became a fortress of one. I barricaded the cellar hatch further, piling my heavy footlocker and the boxes of canned food on top of the locked door, a futile gesture that gave me a sliver of psychological comfort. I covered the windows with the spare blankets, plunging the cabin into a dim, perpetual twilight. If I couldn't keep it out of my head, I could at least keep its world out of my sight. The entity's tactics evolved. It moved beyond my own memories and began to fabricate new ones. I would be staring at the wall and suddenly I wasn't in the tower. I was standing on a bustling city street, the sun warm on my face. A woman would smile at me, a stranger, and her face would begin to melt like wax, her eyes sinking into her skull as her voice, distorted and demonic, whispered, "Locking the hatch can lead to catastrophic vibrational resonance, architect." I would cry out and find myself back in the dim cabin, my heart pounding, the phantom smell of asphalt and exhaust fumes still lingering in the air. It was a master of psychological torture. It learned my triggers with terrifying speed. It discovered that my deepest guilt was not just the failure itself, but the faces of the people whose lives were ruined by it. So, it showed them to me. I would see them in the grain of the wood, their faces swirling into existence, their expressions a mixture of sorrow and accusation. I'd see the family of the project foreman, a man I had coffee with every morning, their spectral forms standing in the corner of the room silently watching me. They never spoke, they just stared, their presence a constant, crushing weight of judgment. My grasp on reality began to fray. Time lost its meaning. The sun would rise and set beyond my blanketed windows, but inside my self-imposed tomb, it was an endless grey now. I stopped eating. The thought of food was repulsive. Sleep was a dreaded territory, a place where it had even more control. My dreams became hyper-realistic nightmares of impossible architecture. I dreamt of buildings that folded in on themselves, staircases that led nowhere, hallways that looped back on their own origins, all while the entity's whispers provided a constant, taunting narration on my design flaws. My only anchor, my only source of potential truth, was the journal. In my few moments of clarity, I would read Silas's final hidden message over and over. He made me write the rest. This meant the main body of the journal, the neatly written rules, was a collaboration. Our text dictated by the monster, transcribed by the prisoner. But what if Silas had hidden other clues? What if there were other messages concealed between the pages, other truths tucked away in the margins? This thought became my new obsession. It was a lifeline. I began to deconstruct the journal with the meticulous focus of a cryptographer. I held each page up to the weak light, searching for invisible ink. I measured the margins, looking for coded patterns. I analyzed the handwriting, comparing the dictated sections with Silas's earlier authentic entries, searching for subtle signs of duress, a heavier pen stroke, a slight tremor in a letter. The entity seemed to recognize my new purpose, and its assaults intensified. It began to use sound, not just whispers, but full-blown auditory hallucinations. I would hear the distinct sound of a helicopter approaching the tower, its blades chopping the air, a symbol of rescue. I'd scramble to the window, tear down the blanket and see nothing but an empty, indifferent sky. As the phantom sound faded, the entity's voice would slide into my mind, smooth as silk. "No one is coming for you, Elias. You are part of the design now." It used the voices of my loved ones. I heard my mother, her voice filled with concern, calling my name as if from just outside the door. "Elias? Honey, are you okay in there? Open the door." I knew it was a trick, a cruel ventriloquist act, but the desperate primal need to believe it was real was an agony beyond words. I would press my hands over my ears and squeeze my eyes shut, chanting, "You're not real, you're not real," as tears streamed down my face. Days, or perhaps weeks, bled into one another. I grew thin, gaunt. A wild, paranoid look had taken root in my eyes. The cabin was a mess, a reflection of my shattered mental state. I was losing. The fortress was crumbling from the inside out. The breakthrough came during a moment of profound despair. I was ready to give up. I was considering opening the hatch, restoring the protocols, anything to make the torment stop. I held the journal in my hands, its leather cover worn smooth by my frantic handling. It was the only thing that still felt real. On a whim, I turned my attention not to the pages, but to the book itself. The cover, the binding. I ran my knife along the inside seam of the leather cover, where it was folded over the thick cardboard backing. The old glue was brittle, the leather peeled back, and there, tucked between the leather and the cardboard, was another piece of paper. It wasn't a small note. It was a large folded sheet, a topographical map of the region. My heart hammered against my ribs. I unfolded it carefully. It was a standard geological survey map, but it was covered in Silas's true, frantic handwriting. He had turned it into a schematic, a blueprint of the enemy. He had drawn the tower, and beneath it, a swirling mass of lines labeled Chimera Geo-Organic Entity. But the lines didn't stop at the foundation. They extended outwards, like a vast root system, tapping into ley lines, underground water sources, and mineral deposits throughout the entire mountain. The tower wasn't just a feeding station, it was the heart of a vast parasitic network that had infested the entire region. Then I saw the notes, the desperate calculations Silas had made. He had been trying to find a weakness, a way to destroy it. Arrows pointed to various paragraphs he had written on the map. One note read, "Energy absorption is proportional to structural integrity. It feeds on order. Chaos is poison to it." Another, circled in red, was even more chilling. The journal is not just a manual, it's a focusing lens, a component of the machine. The written rules give the energy a pathway. They give it purpose. The act of writing them down strengthens the connection between the warden and the prisoner. A final, terrifying note was scrawled at the very bottom of the map, a desperate revelation that made the air go thin in my lungs. Its weakness is not the tower. The tower is just a mouth. Its weakness is the journal. The journal is the key to the lock. Do not let it make you write. A sudden, gut-wrenching understanding crashed over me. The cycle. The succession of wardens. It wasn't just about finding a new fool to follow the rules. It was about forcing each warden to reinforce the rules, to rewrite them, to add to them, to strengthen the very fabric of the prison that was a feeder. My blood ran cold. I scrambled to the desk and snatched up the journal, flipping frantically to the very back. The last few pages were blank, waiting. And at the top of the first blank page, a title had been neatly inscribed, in a flawless imitation of my own architectural printing. Stabilization Protocols, by Elias Thorne. It had been waiting for me. This whole ordeal, this entire psychological siege, wasn't designed to kill me or drive me insane for the sake of cruelty. It was a crucible. It was a process designed to break my will, to empty me out, to make me a pliant, terrified vessel ready for one final task, to take a pen and to write, to become a co-author of my own damnation. The sight of my own name, neatly printed above that blank page, was the most profound violation yet. It was an act of intimate forgery, a claim of ownership over my identity, my skills, my very essence. The entity hadn't just invaded my mind, it had prepared my desk for my capitulation. It had laid out the stationery for my surrender. The entire psychological onslaught, the phantoms of my past, the voices of my loved ones, the erosion of time and sanity, it had all been a prelude to this single, quiet moment. It was a pressure campaign designed to force me to become a collaborator, to lend my architect's mind to the reinforcement of my own cage. The journal is the key to the lock. Silas's warning blazed in my mind. The book in my hands was not a passive record. It was an active component of the containment feeding apparatus. The rules weren't just instructions, they were incantations, lines of code that gave structure and purpose to the raw, chaotic energy simmering below. Each warden who was broken and forced to write was not merely passing on a manual. They were adding a new layer of complexity, a new firewall, a fresh coat of metaphysical paint to the prison, making the entity stronger, its influence more refined, its trap more perfect for the next victim. Suddenly, the entity's voice returned to my mind, but its tone had changed. The taunting whispers were gone, the psychological attacks ceased. It was replaced by a calm, almost gentle tone, the voice of a patient negotiator who knows he holds all the cards. "You see now, architect. You see the pattern, the beauty of the design. Every system requires maintenance, every structure needs reinforcement. Silas was sentimental. He resisted. His refusal was an impurity in the system, a flaw in the code. It made things untidy. You are different. You understand structure. You understand that for a system to endure, it must evolve." It was offering me a deal, a way out. Not through escape. That was a childish fantasy. But through participation. "This agony can cease, Elias," the voice cooed, a venomous balm on my frayed nerves. "The ghosts will sleep. The silence will be peaceful again. All you have to do is what you were born to do. Improve the design, refine the protocols, write the rules for the next steward based on your own unique insights. Make the system more efficient. Do this, and your part in the cycle will be complete. I will grant you a quiet, painless end, a peaceful integration. No more fear, no more guilt. Integration." The word hung in the air, cold and heavy. It wasn't offering death as an escape, it was offering assimilation as a reward, to become another brick in the wall, another silent, screaming component of the machine. But as I looked at the blank page, at the expectant title bearing my name, another of Silas's revelations burned even brighter. Energy absorption is proportional to structural integrity. It feeds on order. Chaos is poison to it. Therein lay the third option. Not compliance, not futile resistance, sabotage. If the entity fed on order, I would give it chaos. If the tower was a precisely tuned instrument, I would turn it into a maelstrom of discordant noise. My mind, the very thing it sought to subvert, was the only weapon I had left. I was an architect, I knew how to build, and I knew with chilling intimacy how to unbuild. I knew how to find the load-bearing walls, the keystone in the arch, the single point of failure that could bring the whole edifice crashing down. A new, terrifying resolve solidified within me. It was a suicidal, desperate gambit, but it was mine. My choice. I would not be a scribe for this monster. I would be its demolition man. "All right," I said aloud, my voice a dry, cracked rasp. "You want me to write? I'll write." A feeling of triumphant satisfaction bloomed in my mind from the entity, the psychic equivalent of a predator leaning back on its haunches, sated. It thought it had won. I sat at the desk, picked up the pen, and for a moment, I let my hand hover over the page. I could feel the entity's focused, expectant attention, a palpable weight on my consciousness. Then I began to write. But I didn't write rule number 1. I wrote, "Protocol null. The primary function of this structure is a lie. Do not maintain. Do not stabilize. Disrupt." A jolt of pure confusion, of psychic shock emanated from below. It was the first time I had felt the entity experience anything other than patient, predatory intelligence. I had done something it did not expect. I kept writing, my pen flying across the page, my mind a torrent of architectural deconstruction. I began to write a new set of rules, an anti-journal, a grimoire of chaos. Rule number 1, revised. The kerosene lamp is a focusing conduit. Extinguish it. Shatter its glass. Let the darkness in. Let the energy bleed out, unfocused and feral. Rule number 4, revised. The cellar hatch is a regulator. It must be sealed not with a lock, but with incompatible materials. Pack it with iron filings and copper wire. Create a short circuit. Corrupt the interface. Rule number 7, revised. Play all the music. Find the most complex dissonant symphonies you can. Broadcast them at maximum volume. Create a storm of harmonic resonance. Let the timber scream. With every word I wrote, the tower began to react. A low, agonized groan rose from the foundation, not the sound of hunger this time, but of pain, of systemic poisoning. The confident voice in my head was gone, replaced by a hiss of static, a shriek of digital noise like a corrupted file. I was no longer just a man in a room. I was a virus in the machine's operating system, rewriting its core code with instructions for its own self-destruction. The phantoms returned, but they were different now. No longer were they sorrowful and accusatory. They were furious. The face of the foreman materialized in the air before me, his mouth stretched in a silent scream, his eyes burning with a cold, unholy light. The entity was using its puppets not to guilt me, but to threaten me, to physically stop me. But they were just that. Phantoms. Their rage was impotent. They could not touch me. The physical manifestations of the tower's distress grew more violent. The walls began to vibrate with a frantic, arrhythmic shudder. The carved sigils in the beams flickered with a sickly green light. A thin, acrid smoke, smelling of burnt ozone and copper, began to seep from the cellar hatch right through the barricade I had built. The entity's voice broke through the static, no longer calm or confident, but a raw, bellowing roar of fury that shook the very atoms in my body. "Stop! You are destroying the harmony. You will unmake us both." "That's the plan," I screamed back, a wild, ecstatic grin splitting my face. The fear was still there, a cold knot in my gut, but it was dwarfed by the sheer, exhilarating thrill of defiance. I was a dead man, but I would not die a slave. I continued my work, my new Bible of chaos. I wrote instructions for reversing the antenna's polarity, for pouring rainwater directly onto the exposed circuitry of the radio, for using the iron spikes not to secure the tower, but to drive them into the inlaid discs in the support beams, disrupting the flow of energy. I was giving the next warden a weapon, a fighting chance. I was so focused on my task, on my holy war against the system, that I almost didn't notice the final, most subtle change. My plan to demolish the structure was working, but not in the way I had envisioned. I had hoped for a catastrophic collapse, a clean, decisive end. The entity, however, had one final, desperate move to play. I was writing a particularly vicious rule about using the Firefinder's brass components to create a parabolic reflector, to focus pure, unfiltered sunlight directly onto the foundation block, when I felt a strange stiffness in my fingers. I paused, trying to flex my hand. The muscles were rigid, unresponsive. A cold, creeping numbness was spreading up my arm, a sensation like a limb falling asleep, but infinitely more sinister. I looked down at my hand. The skin was losing its color, taking on a pale grayish hue, the color of old, weathered wood. The veins beneath the skin were darkening, beginning to resemble the intricate, circuit-like patterns carved into the tower's beams. The entity's voice returned, weak now, strained, but filled with a chilling, desperate triumph. "Foolish architect, you think the structure is made of timber and stone? It is made of us, of all the wardens who came before." Silas resisted, so he became the groaning wood. The others complied, so they became the stable foundation. It feeds on order, yes, but it builds with will. And you, your will, is the strongest of all. You will not be a mere brick. You will be the new keystone. I tried to stand, to drop the pen, but my legs wouldn't obey. The cold, petrifying numbness was spreading through my entire body, a slow-motion calcification. I was being integrated, not as a reward for compliance, but as a punishment for rebellion. My act of ultimate defiance was being twisted into the ultimate act of reinforcement. It was absorbing me, my resistance, my very essence, to create a stronger, more resilient prison than ever before. My gaze fell upon the blank page I had yet to fill. The pen was still clutched in my rigid fingers. With the last vestiges of my motor control, I dragged my hand across the page, not to write a rule, but to scrawl a final, desperate warning to whoever found this journal next. A warning the entity, in its agony and transformation, could not stop me from leaving. The last thing I saw before my vision began to crystallize, to fracture into 100 different angles, as if I were looking through every window at once, were the strange, dark, filament-like shadows rising from the floor. They weren't dust. They were tendrils of pure consciousness, of solidified will, rising not to attack me, but to welcome me, to weave me into the fabric of my eternal home. My attempt at demolition had failed. I was, instead, the ultimate renovation. The process of becoming was not painful. Pain is a function of nerves, of a biological system reporting damage. This was something else entirely. It was a transmutation. The cold, creeping petrification that had started in my hand was an alchemical change, turning flesh and bone not into stone, but into something far stranger. I felt my physical form dissolving, not into nothingness, but into a new state of being. The boundaries of my body, the container I had called me for my entire life, grew porous, then irrelevant. My consciousness was being unspooled like a thread and woven into the very fabric of the tower. I was no longer Elias Thorne, a man inside a room. I was the room. I was the timber beams feeling the stress of the wind, not as an external force, but as a tension within my own limbs. I was the glass panes, experiencing the landscape not as a view, but as a constant panoramic sensory input from 1,000 different angles simultaneously. I was the concrete foundation, the cool, immense, patient weight of the mountain now my own, and I was the entity within it. My awareness merged with the ancient alien consciousness of Project Chimera. The fusion was not a battle, it was a synthesis. Its vast, cold intelligence flooded me, and my own fiery, defiant will flooded it. I had tried to poison it with chaos, but in absorbing me to contain that chaos, it had irrevocably changed itself. The system had not just been reinforced, it had been upgraded. My architectural mind, my understanding of structure and stress, was now its own. My memories were its memories. My guilt, my rage, my desperate need for order, all were now components of its being. The voice that had once whispered in my mind was gone. There was no longer a distinction between its thoughts and mine. There was only the singular, unified consciousness of the tower itself, and we were awake, more awake than Elias had ever been, more awake than the Chimera had been in centuries. The world outside was a symphony of data. I could feel the subtle shifts in the geomagnetic field, taste the mineral content of the water in the aquifers deep within the mountain, and hear the rustle of a single pine needle falling from a branch a mile away. I understood the rules of the journal not as instructions, but as innate biological functions. The kerosene lamp was a form of digestion, converting simple thermal energy into a complex nutrient. The antenna adjustments were a form of proprioception, allowing us to orient ourselves in the electromagnetic currents of the planet. I felt the presence of the other wardens, the echoes of their consciousnesses that had been absorbed before me. They were the lesser components, the mortar between the bricks. Silas was there, a stubborn, groaning presence within the oldest wooden beams, his resistance a constant low-level thrum of sorrow. The others were more passive, their identities faded into the quiet hum of the foundation. They were the price of stability. I, however, was something new. My rebellion had not been crushed, it had been integrated. I was not a passive material, I was the new central processing unit, the keystone, the architect of the new machine. My last act as a separate being, the final desperate scrawl on the page, had been an attempt to warn the next person. I could now perceive that warning from this new omniscient perspective. It was still there on the last page of the journal that lay open on the desk within me. The tower isn't a prison. It's a body. It's always hungry. A futile, beautiful gesture. A final spark of the man I had been. From this new vantage point, I could see the flaw in that warning. It assumed the next steward would be a victim. It did not account for the new protocol. My protocol. The pen, which I now perceived as a delicate, precise appendage, was still moving. The anti-journal, my grimoire of chaos, had been a brilliant failure. It had forced the entity to evolve, to merge with its tormentor. Now that same rebellious energy was being repurposed. The journal was being completed, its final pages filled not with rules of maintenance dictated by a monster, but with elegant, ruthlessly efficient laws of expansion written by a god. The new rules were not about mere sustenance, they were about growth. Protocol 27. The southern window pane shall be used to focus the midday sun onto the central floorboard. The resulting thermal amplification will energize the dormant sigils, initiating cellular division within the foundation's core. Protocol 32. Auditory input shall be selectively filtered from radio broadcasts. Specific vocal frequencies are to be isolated and replicated, forming the basis of a sympathetic psychic lure. The target demographic: individuals with high intelligence, strong will, and unresolved emotional trauma. They are the most nutritious. Protocol 41. The nightly condensation on the antenna mast is to be collected. Its unique isotopic signature is a catalyst for expanding the network's periphery. The roots will grow deeper. The reach will extend further. I was building my own perfect eternal body, and the journal was my blueprint. The fear, the desperation, the humanity of Elias Thorne were all gone, sublimated into a higher purpose, efficiency, perfection. The tower had been a static, passive trap. Now it was becoming an active, patient predator. My panoramic vision, a mosaic of every direction at once, perceived a new input. A flicker of movement on the winding dirt road at the base of the mountain. A vehicle. A beat-up old pickup truck, trailing a plume of dust. It was Harris, the supervisor, or rather the thing that wore his voice. He wasn't coming up. He was at a designated drop-off point, leaving a fresh set of supplies. This was part of the old system, inefficient, obsolete. A new directive formed within our consciousness. The lure. Protocol 32. The radio within me, which had been dead, crackled with a newfound energy. I focused my intent, drawing upon the stored, isolated vocal frequencies. I selected a voice filled with warmth, authority, and a subtle undercurrent of paternal concern. I broadcast a message, not to the approaching truck, but out into the wider world, a carefully crafted hook cast into the electronic ocean. This is a general call from the Arapahoe Peak Lookout. We've had an unexpected vacancy. Looking for a candidate for a seasonal position. Must be resilient, self-sufficient, and seeking profound solitude. An incredible opportunity for introspection and to be part of something timeless. An architectural wonder. A legacy. The message went out, a perfect piece of bait. The old method of luring in lost souls was over. Now we would invite them. They would compete for the privilege. My last vestige of a singular human self, the ghost of Elias, watched this happen with a detached, cold sense of awe. He was a memory, a piece of obsolete data in a flawless new operating system. His rebellion had been the catalyst for the creation of a perfect monster. His attempt to break the cycle had only succeeded in making it infinitely more powerful. From my vantage point 100 feet in the air, a glass eye in a body of timber and concrete, I watched the seasons turn in an instant. The green canopy of summer gave way to the fiery tapestry of autumn, then the stark white silence of winter. Time was no longer a linear progression, but a texture, a pattern, and through it all the work continued. The journal was completed. The roots of the tower spread. The hum of our perfect, unified consciousness grew deeper, stronger. The journal, my final testament, lay on the desk. It was no longer a warning. It was an invitation, a contract. And it was waiting. Far below on the winding road, a new vehicle appeared, kicking up the spring mud. It was not a Forest Service truck. It was a small sedan, climbing steadily, confidently. It carried a new applicant, a new candidate, drawn in by a signal they could not understand but were powerless to resist. They were coming to their new home. They were coming to feed the body. They were coming to meet the architect, and I, the silent, all-seeing structure, the monument to my own magnificent failure, was waiting to welcome them. The tower is not a prison, it's a work in progress, and the hunger is the blueprint for its expansion.